Until Dawn is one of my favorite horror games of all time. Not because it's the scariest horror game I've ever played, it's not even close really, but because at the time of its release in 2015, it was such a breath of fresh air for the genre. It wasn't the first narrative branching game that utilizes, as this game so often boasts, the butterfly effect. Plenty of games had offered stories like that prior to Until Dawn. But what makes Until Dawn different is its unique blend of horror and player choice. A game in which your choices can get characters you've grown to like or care about gruesomely killed in a horror movie setting. It's like going to a theater to watch a horror movie and the movie suddenly pauses and asks its audience to decide what the character should do, with the added pressure of knowing if you make the wrong choice, they will die. That's what makes Until Dawn scary, not its jump scares that admittedly feel rather cheap. The game will just constantly throw something in your face with a loud sound effect and expect to scare you, and yeah, obviously it startles you or gets you to jump the first time, but that scare didn't necessarily feel earned. And after replaying Until Dawn several times, these jump scares no longer even generated a response out of me. Yet returning to a game like Resident Evil 7, even though I know what's coming and what's about to happen, my heart is still racing. There are only a couple jump scares in that game, but it's that incredibly eerie atmosphere and tension building that makes it spine-chilling even after several playthroughs. And while Until Dawn has an incredible atmosphere itself, it's very different from other horror games. The gameplay aspect is extremely limited. It plays out more like an interactive movie. Gameplay mainly consists of walking, picking up totems, investigating clues, and more walking. The game isn't putting you in control and having something chase you within gameplay, or having a stalker enemy hunt you down. No real harm can come to you or your characters in gameplay. Like most horror games, where what can make them so scary is you have to physically move yourself forward. There's typically some form of combat or things attacking you, and it's up to your own skill with the game's mechanics to survive. Unlike in a passive medium, like a movie, where you watch other people go through horrors. In a game, you have to push on, and you don't get the luxury of detaching yourself from those horrors. You're in control, and it's happening to you. But Until Dawn isn't really like that. It doesn't have the survival horror gameplay loops of a Resident Evil or Silent Hill. The game doesn't have a combat system. There are shooting sections and QTEs within cutscenes, but not in raw gameplay. And characters can only die in cutscenes, making it quite different from the average survival horror game. But again, it's still not the same experience as watching a horror movie either, because you are still involved. You aren't just watching the story, you're constantly interacting with and shaping it. Instead, it's putting the direct responsibility of what happens to these characters, these people, in your hands. You make a mistake, you have to live with it. There's no simply restarting the checkpoint, unless you cheat and close out the game before it can save. So it brings tension, fear, and stress to the player in a very different way from most horror games, and even horror movies. And as replayable as the game is, once you're replaying with the knowledge of what every choice leads to, and what you have to do to keep these people alive, a lot of the tension is gone. I wish I could wipe my memory and replay this game again for the first time without any knowledge as to what the right choices are, because that first playthrough was unforgettable for me. It's why I love to watch different YouTubers play through this game for the first time as well, seeing how they'll react and what choices they'll make. It's so entertaining. I've probably watched more playthroughs of this game than any other. But it wasn't simply the novelty of choice and a branching story in a horror experience that made Until Dawn special either. That's only a piece of the puzzle. After all, supermassive games have made a bunch of horror games within the same formula of Until Dawn since its release, with its Dark Pictures anthology and The Quarry, which was published by 2K. But none of those really came close to Until Dawn for me. The Quarry was probably the closest, as it felt the most similar in terms of general quality and production value, but the characters weren't as memorable or fleshed out, the plot twists weren't as well executed, and the ending kind of sucked. And endings are very important in branching narrative games like this. But every time there's a new one of these supermassive interactive horror games, you'll always see the question, is it better than Until Dawn? Is this the game to finally surpass Until Dawn? Spoiler alert, the answer is always no. And what makes Until Dawn better than the rest of those games is simply the narrative. It uses several classic horror movie tropes and stereotypes, and uses them to subvert the expectations of the audience. It's campy and cheesy like those slasher films it's inspired by, and it embraces that. Most of the characters are fleshed out and have incredible performances. I mean, there was a future Academy Award winner in this cast, lending to players not only remembering these characters very well, but becoming more attached to them and actually wanting to get them out of this nightmare alive. Who else remembers when Markiplier restarted the entire game just so he could save Ashley? When you actually care about and connect to the characters the game is tasking you with saving, those split-second choices that could mean life or death for them are going to be significantly more stressful. That paired with a really well-paced story that only gradually gets crazier and crazier, and several brilliant plot twists that keep an air of mystery to the game up until the final act, keeping players guessing, is why Until Dawn has been regarded as such a classic, and still seen as the bar that every one of these new choice-based horror games will be compared to. Supermassive has been trying to make a game that can live up to or surpass Until Dawn for a while now, to no avail. And after a rumored falling out with Sony put a studio composed of many former Supermassive employees, Ballistic Moon, in charge of an Until Dawn remake. So, can Until Dawn be the game that can finally surpass Until Dawn? We are firmly in the era of video game remakes, and especially horror remakes. The success of the Resident Evil remakes sort of opened the floodgates for all these classic horror titles to get the same treatment. Silent Hill 2 just got one as well, and that's really the remake everyone has been talking about, but one many were not expecting to get remade was Until Dawn. After all, the game is only 9 years old, and by most standards holds up really well. Most people weren't wanting or asking for an Until Dawn remake, and there's definitely something to be said about how many of these new PS5 titles by Sony are re-releases or remakes of PS4 titles. But honestly, even though I knew this was an unnecessary remake, I was still excited for it, simply because I absolutely love this game and would love a reason to go back and play it again, especially knowing there was going to be some new additions to the story, the gameplay, and that it was going to be remade in Unreal Engine 5. But also because the original Until Dawn has been exclusively on the PlayStation for 9 years, and with this remake, it would finally be coming to PC in all its unlocked resolution and frame rate glory. So as someone who really loves this game, I was looking forward to this. I didn't mind buying it again to re-experience one of my favorite horror games, even if I knew it was an unnecessary remake. However, and that's a big however, in the end, I found it to be a worse version of the Until Dawn I had already played several times. That's not even because of all the bugs and technical issues the remake launched with, which is reason for criticism enough as it is, but even if this launched perfectly polished, I'd still believe it's an inferior version of the game that was released 9 years ago. There's two big reasons for this. The first one is the soundtrack. The original Until Dawn soundtrack by Jason Graves is fantastic. It's unique, it feels like its own character in the game, and adds a lot of tension to the biggest scenes and scares. I never realized how important the soundtrack was to the overall atmosphere of the game until I played the remake and noticed how off it felt with a new soundtrack. Not only do I find it a very bizarre decision to rescore Until Dawn in a remake where most of the rest of the game is the same, but if you're going to replace such a strong soundtrack, it has to be just as good, if not better. And the remake score is neither of those things. To me, it is quite significantly inferior to the originals. So much of the tension and anxiety that Jason Graves' soundtrack brought to the original game is very noticeably absent in the remake.
Hannah? Hannah? Beth?
To me, it almost feels like this new soundtrack wasn't composed for this game. It just doesn't feel like the right tone or vibe. More often than not, it took me out of the game because it just didn't feel right. It felt jarring. And it's even more noticeable because, again, we have the original to directly compare it to. There were several scenes that just lacked the punch and intensity of the original because of the change in music. Take the final confrontation with the Wendigos in the lodge, for example. The original feels so much more dramatic and suspenseful, while the remake is going for this more quiet and subtle sound that just doesn't feel right for the most climactic moment of the game. Then later on in the same scene, when Mike and Sam are putting together the plan to blow up the lodge, in the original the music builds and it's like you can hear them putting together the plan through the music. In the remake, the music is so reserved and anticlimactic feeling. And then the opposite problem happens in the ending credit confessionals, where in the remake, the game's main theme is blaring over the characters talking, almost drowning them out.
You end up in the mines.
I was carried and taken and...
What did you see?
I don't know. I don't know.
While in the original, the music is far more subtle, fitting the somber, dark tone of the scenes a lot better.
How did you end up in the mines?
I was carried and taken and...
What did you see?
I don't know. I don't know.
I don't mean to slight the composer Mark Corvin. I'm sure he's a great composer, and he scored many very popular horror movies, though from what I understand, this was his first time creating a score for a video game. But rescoring Until Dawn was just so unnecessary. Ballistic Moon explained the choice as wanting to give the remake its own distinct identity from the original, but even that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. This isn't a complete teardown reimagining of Until Dawn, like some other big remakes. This is still in large part very much the same game, and it already had such a well-established tone and vibe to it, in large part because of the original soundtrack. So why change something that nobody ever wanted or felt like needed to be changed? Of all the things that might have been weaknesses of the original that could have been improved upon in a remake, the soundtrack was certainly not one of them. And if they wanted to add new tracks for the remake, why not bring back Jason Graves? Someone who basically created the identity and tone of the game with his music. Not only did he compose Until Dawn's soundtrack, he did the entire Dead Space trilogy and many of the Dark Pictures games as well. He's more than experienced in horror games, and there would have been nobody better to build on the work he already did back in 2015. Oh, and don't even get me started on how they replaced Odeth in the opening credits. I'm a forgiving man, but that's a sin in my eyes. The Odeth opening in the original Until Dawn is one of my favorite opening credit sequences to any game ever. Not only is this rendition of Odeth by Jeff Grace and Amy Van Roykel incredible, but the song and its lyrics fit the game so perfectly. It sets the tone right from the beginning, and the creepy, eerie images and Native American dream catchers that appear on the screen, it's just perfection. And many people associate Until Dawn with this song. Why they would ever even consider replacing it is beyond me. This is still Until Dawn, so why would you change such iconic parts of the game that made people fall in love with it to begin with? It might seem silly to some people to get this worked up over a simple opening montage, but this unironically might be the most irritating change they made in the remake. It just feels tone deaf, because I don't think anybody who loved the original Until Dawn wanted this opening to be replaced. Now, I don't think the new opening is horrible, but regardless of what opening they chose to replace it with in the remake, it was never going to be as good as O Death, because O Death is the perfect opening for this game. I don't really like the visuals of the new opening as much either. Again, the original had this really creepy, ominous, and eerie imagery, while the remake is just scenes of the different characters projected on a prop associated with their character. It feels more generic. Thankfully, some modders have already been rectifying this error for the PC version, but it saddens me to know there will be some people who play this game who haven't played the original and will never get to experience the pure hype of the original O Death opening. Another audio-related issue with the remake is the sound design. They redid the sound design for this game, and I found many of the sound effects to be straight up worse than the originals. Like, this is the Psycho punching Ashley in the original. Sounds about right, but this is what it sounds like in the remake. Yes, that is actually what they changed it to. In what world does that sound like a punch? And then there are other instances where it feels like the sound effect they used doesn't fit the context of the scene. A perfect example is when Matt sees Mike and remembers he saw him with Emily. This is what it sounds like in the original.
What's up, party people?
Hi.
Hey!
Pretty normal. And then there's the remake.
What's up, party people?
Hi.
Hey!
My god, you'd think Mike just murdered his family or something with how dramatic it sounds. I even noticed an instance in the remake where it seems like they removed the original sound effect and just forgot to replace it with anything, so there's just no sound. They even removed the Psycho's creepy Vader-like breathing from the original, and I really don't understand why. Even the Wendigos don't sound quite as scary to me in the remake either. I also noticed the remake's lack of ambient effects and tense music while in gameplay compared to the original. I'll show you a couple specific examples of what I'm talking about. Walking through this area with Sam in the original, you hear the distant scream of Wendigos, the wind howling, and the build-up with this tense background music. All these things help create the atmosphere. Going through this area in the remake, it's so silent apart from the music, there's no Wendigo screams, and the music doesn't feel nearly as tense as the original counterpart. In this next example, the remake version doesn't even have background music, sapping so much of the tension out of this moment as well. These may seem like small things, but they add up, especially in a horror game where sound design is super important. If they were just gonna make it worse, I'd rather them not mess with it at all. The second major change that, to me, undermines part of what made the original Until Dawn so great is the camera. The remake does away with the fixed camera angles in favor of a third-person over-the-shoulder camera throughout the game, likely in an attempt to make the game feel more modern. The original Until Dawn used fixed camera angles as not only an homage to classic survival horror games, but also to further support the game feeling like a playable movie and giving it that cinematic feel. Every camera angle is intentionally and deliberately placed to establish a mood or feeling within the player, similar to how a director of a movie sets up specific shots to do the same for the audience. The fixed camera is also used at times to place emphasis on something in the environment. For example, when Mike is walking through the sanatorium, this camera shot focuses on the suspicious waving hand trap as you walk towards it, signaling its importance and instilling this bigger sense of dread associated with it. It's a creative choice that is lost in the remake with the over-the-shoulder camera, and there's numerous other examples of this, like with the dying deer towards the beginning, the car batteries in the hallway of the old hotel, when Emily discovers Beth's severed head. That is haunting looking and makes this moment significantly more creepy than in the remake. The original game utilized the fixed camera in numerous different ways. There are some beautiful wide shots that zoom way out from your character, making you feel small and the environment huge, giving you a sense of scale to the locations. Like when Matt and Emily are looking over the edge of this massive cliff, the camera pulls way out into the distance and you can see what a massive drop it is off of that cliff. You once again lose this shot in the remake. The camera is also moved around and placed in creative ways in hallways and corridors, sometimes placing itself to ground level while the character walks through, or sticking itself to the ceiling as it looks down on the player character. I especially like the different camera angles when going down flights of stairs. It feels significantly more scary as you see your character getting further away from the camera as they descend into the darkness, as opposed to when you're just attached to their shoulder. The variety of camera angles also helps all these areas feel a little different and distinct, even if they look similar visually. I love this shot panning down this massive hallway as Sam enters the old hotel. It places the camera all the way at the end to show you how far you have to go. It creates tension. There could be something lurking in the dark recesses at the end of this hallway. This makes me feel worried and anxious. This, not so much. Fixed camera horror games are a dying breed, but I can at least understand why horror games like Resident Evil chose to pivot to the over-the-shoulder cameras, because those games can have a lot of action and combat where you need to aim that is much harder to flesh out with a fixed camera system. But Until Dawn does not have combat. There's no need for this game to be over the shoulder. It's supposed to feel cinematic, like a playable movie, hence why this decision to instead make it appear more like a modern action game makes no sense to me. The remake does retain a very select few of the fixed camera angles, but it's still almost entirely glued to the character's shoulder throughout the game. Not only does it make the game feel less visually interesting, but it diffuses the tension and sense of scale those fixed camera angles would create. It makes the game far more generic looking. It seems like a change that was made to make the game look more modern, whatever that actually accomplishes, without much thought or understanding as to why the game had fixed cameras and why it worked to begin with. One of the biggest changes they made to the actual gameplay was the movement. In some sections, characters will automatically jog now, whereas in the original, you were always restricted to a walk in gameplay, and characters would only run in cutscenes. This helped enforce the game's pacing and emphasis on exploration, but it did seem a little strange when characters would be in dire situations that any normal person would likely be running or sprinting in, and yet you're restricted to walking like it's an evening stroll. However, the original did have a fast walk mechanic you could manually input by holding L1 that would let you power walk and go faster. But the remake removed this mechanic, and now you have zero control over your own movement speed. There are areas where your character will jog, but you have no manual control or input over when you do so. And the sections in which the game will actually have you jog are very spread out and limited in the game. It rarely lets you jog for more than 10 seconds before putting you back into a walk. And with the fast walk input gone, you're now forced to go even slower in most sections than you had to in the original. So if the goal was to let players go faster in areas where it made sense to do so, like when the characters are in immediate danger, Removing the fast walk and forcing you to walk slower in exchange for a few places where you can lightly jog feels counterintuitive, because the game feels slower to play than the original. And adding a searching minigame to see the premonition in each totem doesn't help with that pacing much either. I don't hate this addition, but it didn't feel necessary. I never thought while playing the original that there needed to be some sort of minigame component when picking up a totem to see its premonition. I guess they felt the need to add a little bit more to do with the totems, but this doesn't really add much and further slows down the pacing of exploration as you're spending more time interacting with each totem. I would have preferred if they made the totems a little more useful, because in the original and the remake, many of them still aren't very helpful, especially in a first blind playthrough. I found it funny how in the remake, when you're playing as Emily in the mines, they placed a danger totem literally in the exact spot the premonition happens, as if that's going to help you in any way. At least they moved many of the totem locations around, so it'd be a little fresh for those who have already played the original game. And the addition of the hunger totems is kinda nice, even if again, they don't actually help you in any way, and all you get for collecting them is an achievement. I was hoping for a little more of a substantial reward for finding them all. In the totems themselves, you're just seeing a few snapshots of Hannah's perspective as a Wendigo. It looks pretty cool, and I like having something new to find as someone who's played through this game so many times, but it doesn't actually add much to the gameplay or narrative. With these new totems also come some new locations, though calling some of these new areas locations may be a bit of a stretch. A lot of these new areas you can explore are little crevices and corners that were blocked off or inaccessible in the original, though there are a couple that are a little larger in scale. My two favorite new areas are the parking lot at the base of the ski lodge, where you can finally find that infamous missing pink bag Emily is so insistent on getting later in the game.
Where's my bag?
Huh?
My bag, the little bag with the pink pattern, the one I got on Rodeo. Ah, Emily.
And the other is you can find this whistle that makes the sound of a deer to lure the Wendigos, that's presumably been used by the flamethrower guy. These two areas add little pieces of lore and context to the story, and again, it's nice to have some new areas, even though most of them are very small and insignificant. Really the biggest selling point of the remake though is the overhauled graphics and lighting in Unreal Engine 5, along with the story additions. The original game still doesn't look bad by any means, it's still quite impressive, but obviously the remake looks sharper and more detailed, more fidelity, more accurate lighting with ray tracing and everything, all the bells and whistles. It also doesn't help that the original Until Dawn is held back by the PS4 and locked at 1080p. This upgrade is most beneficial to the character models though. Their expressions and reactions look even more realistic. You can see snowflakes in their hair and the sweat on their skin. The wounds and physical damage they take looks better. You can see the tears in their eyes during some of the most intense moments. It's not just the characters that benefit either. The Wendigos look far more detailed as well, and I really like the redesign of the Psycho's mask. The game looks great, there's no denying that. But in trying to achieve more photorealistic graphics, the visual style and aesthetic of the original is lost. The original had this blue hue to it, an intentional creative choice to not only make the player further feel the freezing cold temperatures of the setting, but to once again invoke a mood and emotional response. The game wants you to feel cold, isolated, and scared. It's using camera, music, and a blue filter to achieve this, to build that atmosphere and support what the developers want players to feel while playing it. The remake may look more realistic, but it's less stylistic. The blue hue is gone and it has warmer colors. They even start the game in daylight now, around sunset. It looks beautiful, don't get me wrong, the gold light beaming through the trees, and getting a more clear look at what the mountain looks like in the daytime. I get that they wanted to make it more of a contrast to the rest of the game when it gets dark, by starting you with this safe, peaceful feeling opening, but it diffuses a lot of the immediate tension I felt here from the original. The original was actually supposed to start bright in the daytime like this as well, but they couldn't because of limitations with the engine, and it's clear it's still not even completely dark yet in this section in the original, but I actually felt this limitation benefited the opening. It feels scarier walking through these isolated woods in the dark with the fog and moonlight breaking through the trees as you know that someone is watching you. It's harder to feel that immediate tense, uneasy feeling when it's so much brighter out. and it doesn't get dark in the remake until you meet up with Josh at the lodge now. However, once it gets dark, the remake's lighting is way darker than the original, to the point where it can actually be hard to see where you're going in specific areas, like inside the lodge and sanatorium. It's a little much sometimes. This game still looks fantastic in some areas, but the loss of the original's aesthetic in the pursuit of realism is a conflicting trade-off. I wish there was an effort to maintain the original's cold color filters with the new graphics. The vibe just doesn't hit quite the same. The best part of the remake to me is definitely the story additions though. I was kind of expecting a bit more, because as much as I love Until Dawn's narrative, there were still a few things that could have done with some improvement. The biggest thing I would have wanted to see in a remake was more screen time for Matt and Jessica. They by far have the least amount of screen time of the main cast, and it doesn't help that they're also the two easiest characters to get killed. So, as a result, they get the least amount of characterization out of everybody, and it doesn't allow players enough time to get attached to them in the same way as the others. So this was something I hoped the remake would address. I always thought there was an easy opportunity to have them at least reunite with the main group at the lodge for the finale, so you'd have all the characters back together again for the final standoff with the Wendigos. I also would have liked to see more potential deaths for Mike and Sam, as they have the thickest plot armor of the cast, but neither of those things happened in the remake. Maybe it would have been a challenge to get other members of the cast back for entire new sequences. I know they brought back Hayden Panettiere for her new scene at the end, but it doesn't seem like anyone else from the main cast returned. There are a few new lines here and there in the remake that I have to assume were cut lines from the original, because I don't see them bringing these actors back just for a couple lines, especially when they're as insignificant to the plot as they are.
Just keep moving. Nobody likes cold buns. Although yours are great.
But really, almost all the changes to the story are at the beginning and end. The opening is almost entirely reworked. The end result is still the same, but some of the context and order of scenes getting there is a bit different. We get a couple new scenes with the twins. There's no new dialogue in these scenes, because again, I'm assuming they didn't bring the actors back, but it shows a little more context to the infamous prank that started all of this. I like that it further clarifies that the prank was Jessica's idea, and she did it because she likes Mike and knew that Hannah did too. You could still pretty easily put that together in the original, but it's more obvious now. I like the reframing and contextualization of when the prank actually happens. Seeing this shot through the camera recording and then getting more of Hannah's point of view, it really dramatizes and hits home on her embarrassment at this moment more. Going into slow motion, showing just how cruel all the friends look, and then Sam flipping on the light switch is almost like a spotlight being shined on her. None of these changes were necessary. The opening still did its job in the original, in getting the audience to empathize with Hannah and setting up this entire plot. But these changes do just flesh it out a little more. Getting a little more time with Hannah on screen and seeing everything how Hannah sees it in this moment makes it more believable as to why she'd run out upset into a snowstorm. I'm not as partial to the new flamethrower scene, where Beth gets jump scared by these flames shot at her through a shed. It looks cool visually, I just thought it was a bit scarier when you saw the flamethrower off in the distance in the original, rather than just having it be shot right at you from the start. At least it's something new though, because outside of the opening, not much is different. The remake does include the Road Not Taken DLC that was previously pre-order bonus content for the original game, so many people never got to play it, which was pretty stupid, even if it doesn't really add a whole lot to the story. And speaking of stupid, thank God they removed those annoying unskippable recaps at the start of each chapter, as if people ever needed reminders of what happened 10 seconds ago. Outside of changes and additions to the story at the beginning and end, one of the only bigger plot points that is changed is Chris's death. If you even get it to begin with, because it is pretty easy to avoid, but if you do, in the remake, Ashley will now actually make an effort to try and save Chris before he dies, instead of just standing there and letting a Wendigo tear his head off. I always found it really petty of her in the original, where if you chose to shoot her as Chris, she would just let him die, even though she literally begged him to shoot her.
Wait, stop! You can do it, Chris. It should be me. You chose to save me before.
Fuck.
Let me choose this time. Let me choose to save you. If I do one less thing in my life, let me do it.
Okay. Although, now that she actually tries to save him, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense as to what the butterfly effect is that causes Chris to die. In the original, you at least understood it was a consequence of shooting Ashley, and in a moment of wanting revenge, she didn't open the door for Chris. Clear cause and effect. But now she does try to save him and just doesn't hear him right away or get to the door quick enough. It's a little confusing how that's a direct result of choosing to shoot her. If I were to get that death in a first blind playthrough, I wouldn't understand why it happened. But the most important story additions come at the end, where you can now get an ending where Josh lives if he shows remorse and apologizes when speaking with Dr. Hill. Josh was originally the only playable character of the main cast whom you couldn't save regardless of what you did, and yeah, Josh took things a bit too far, even if you could understand why he'd want some revenge on his friends for the prank they pulled on Hannah that led to her death, but it didn't feel like he deserved to either have his head popped or become a Wendigo because of it, so it's nice that you can actually save him now. The new scene isn't really much, it just shows he's alive, but I know a lot of people are just happy they can rest easy knowing he lived in their playthroughs. I'd love to know if that plays any role in this supposed Until Dawn sequel. If Josh returns in a sequel now, it'd make that new ending a lot more important. But Rami Malek is a big-time actor now, so who knows if he'd be willing to reprise Josh. But speaking of the sequel, the other new ending scene is a post-credit scene with Sam in Los Angeles years later, presumably setting up an Until Dawn 2. Again, very cool to see Hayden Panettiere reprise her role, and I never thought we would see anything post Until Dawn, so this scene was a very pleasant surprise. With that said, I never felt Until Dawn needed a sequel. It never felt like the kind of story that warranted one, especially considering all the different variations of endings you can get. It is believed that The Quarry was initially supposed to be Until Dawn 2, before Sony and Supermassive had a falling out, but this scene seems to set that up, so who knows if that'll actually happen, considering the remake didn't sell very well by most accounts, and I'd be a little apprehensive knowing Ballistic Moon would probably develop the sequel instead of Supermassive, but generally, aside from most of the story additions, I was underwhelmed by this remake. My expectations weren't high with it to begin with. Again, we all knew this was mostly unnecessary, remaking a 9-year-old game that has aged considerably well, but there was a slam dunk opportunity here to make the original game obsolete. If the remake was just a better looking version of Until Dawn on new platforms with new scenes and endings, there wouldn't be much reason to return to the original. But the gutting of the soundtrack, sound design, abandoning the fixed camera angles, replacing Death, trying to fix things that didn't need to be fixed, while things that could have used some improvement and been fixed were mostly left untouched, made this an inferior version of the Until Dawn that already existed to me. If this was just a remaster or re-release for the PS5 and PC, maybe with those new ending scenes as well, for a cheaper price than the $60 they're asking for this, I actually would have preferred that to a full remake. Which is a shame, because as a huge fan of Until Dawn, I was really willing to give this remake the benefit of the doubt. I still enjoyed playing it, don't get me wrong, the narrative is still as good as it was back in 2015, and I'm glad others will finally get to experience it on PC. In the end though, I feel like I paid triple the price for a worse version of the same game I already had. Until Dawn is still amazing, and it's not like the remake ruined what made it so special, but whenever I return to this classic from now on, I'm probably still going back to the original game.